Okay. Hello, and good evening, everybody. Welcome to tonight's event. My name is Robert Levitt. I'm the acting dean of the Daniels faculty, and I'd like to thank you all for coming out tonight and attending tonight's lecture by Dana Cuff, entitled Architecture, 21st Century's Promise of Spatial Justice. Before we continue, I want to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississauga of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. As many of you may know, the name of the avenue in which the faculty sits, Spadina, comes from the Anishinaabe word Ishpadina and means a place on a hill. The site was also part of an important trail for several First Nations. As an institution committed to promoting truth and reconciliation, we note this history and wish to honor these connections as we move forward collectively. So, now for tonight's presentation. Our guest speaker, Dana Cuff, is a professor of architecture and urban design at UCLA, where she founded and directs cityLAB, a research and design center that initiates experimental projects to explore metropolitan possibilities. In 2019, cityLAB expanded its social and political engagement by creating CoLab in long-term partnership with community organizations in the Westlake MacArthur Park neighborhood of Los Angeles. cityLAB represented the United States in the 2010 Venice Architecture Biennale and has been featured on CNN, in Newsweek, and was named one of the top 4 urban think tanks in the country by Architect magazine. This lab's Housing First research demonstrates that affordable, well-designed housing and neighborhoods are attainable goals in building equitable cities. It has developed high-performance, low-cost housing prototypes for infill sites ranging from backyards to schoolyards. In 2017, after a decade of research that included a full-scale demonstration house, Dana also co-authored California state legislation that effectively opened up 8.1 million single-family lots for secondary rental units. And then, I think, also created pamphlets and modes of communication that helped people to understand how to use the legislation, which was an important component of that, of the effectiveness of these laws. These efforts placed Dana in a special category of academics making huge impacts on the world that we live in. Over the years, Dana has written extensively on the subject of design and inclusion, and she is the author most recently of the 2023 book, Architectures of Spatial Justice, which I've just finished and recommend highly, published by MIT Press. In tonight's presentation, she will draw on her cityLAB work and from architects' works around the world to discuss how practicing architecture can advance spatial and environmental justice. Can advance spatial and environmental justice, demonstrating that design requires contemporary thinking about how to build the world that we want to live in. So after the presentation, we'll have some time for discussion, Dana and I, and then we'll invite members of the audience to discuss as well. So please join me in welcoming Professor Dana Cuff to the stage.
Is this mic? Oh yeah, I can tell it's working fine. Thank you for that nice introduction. It's really a pleasure to be here in Toronto. It went from balmy to totally bone-chilling in the matter of like 2 hours while I was talking to Richard's class, and I'm used to those kind of swings, but probably from the 50 to 70 degree range, so this was new. I want to kind of frame the talk tonight by saying that I don't think of Los Angeles as being an exceptional place. I think a lot of people, especially New Yorkers, want to frame Los Angeles as some weird outlier kind of urban setting. And I actually think that we have a lot in common with Toronto. Maybe you have a more genuine urban core than we do, but we have some of the same suburban problems. I work in Los Angeles in part because it's not very well codified, meaning we don't think we understand it. And that allows me a lot of opportunities to kind of reframe an understanding of the city, particularly from an architectural perspective. And it's over the last 20, 25 years of being there and having started cityLAB that I've come to see spatial justice as at the core of what it is we're trying to do there. And I'm going to bring that story along for you tonight and show you the kind of work we've been doing, and actually the work that's been going on all around the world that is a sort of minor literature, I would say, in architecture, that there's a thread you can pull through the architectural discipline and profession that's one that lifts up various ethical purposes very effectively. And it's only when we start to pull out that narrative that we see the continuity rather than imagining that this is some kind of new and focal point of attention. I also am not trying to think of a spatial justice agenda as one that destroys any part of the core of the discipline. I don't actually think that it is a revolutionary model, and I think you'll see that when you see the work that I'm planning to show. I think it's really in the DNA of what architects do. So when I'm talking about architecture's promise, I'm talking about something that has two parts. And really, Robert's kind introduction framed some of that already. To build the world we want to live in, architecture makes a two-part promise. And I'm making this as a declarative statement because I think it's tacit in the architectural profession and discipline. That promise is to reverse the climate crisis, in other words, so that we can continue living on the planet, and to advance social justice. Both are really ethical commitments to the public at large, and they are commitments of historic proportions. So that's why it's a promise of the 21st century, when we've never been more aware of how important this role for architecture could be. So I'm going to focus on spatial justice because that's my field, but I think that it's deeply intertwined with environmental sustainability and environmental justice. So just to say a little bit about how I get to this work, in 2000, I wrote a book that was really looking at the politics of housing in post-war American cities. And that was this book called The Provisional City that looked at how public housing, it was really pre-war and post-war, was a governmental project that reshaped cities, particularly on the backs of neighborhoods of color, as a kind of modern project in a classic modernist sense. And that culminated maybe 10 years of research I had been doing that led me to think, maybe I need to actually get engaged in action-based research, not just historical research, in order to better understand what it is that's going on within the architecture context. So, I work in an architecture school with a lot of practicing architects, and there was always this way of marginalizing the histories and narratives of the built environment if you also weren't involved in the making of it. Seemed legitimate, maybe I should try it. So cityLAB began in a kind of unusual form of practice, but definitely a form of practice. And with that came these subsequent, I really think of them as big success stories. They were surprising even to me, that we could move from research through demonstrations of design into state policy. And we did that in 2 instances, and we're working on a 3rd now. And that's what's characterized by this book that just came out that you see on the far right. So I'm going to talk about some of this work. I gave a couple of other lectures here in the last 24 hours, and I didn't want to overlap So I can't even quite recall exactly which path we're going to take through tonight because I've been talking so much about my work. But I'll talk about some of this legislation and the basis in design that it's established on. I'll just say also, I have a joint appointment with the planning department, and I find the two cultures so radically disparate that it's a bit incommensurate to try to work across planning and architecture. So in that regard, trying to build an architect's sense of land use policy was a really important step for me. And in a way, it was like learning to write in Etruscan or something like that. It was so foreign that I had no idea really how I might build in all the architectural principles that I thought were important into making decent state-level land use policy. And so that's been an education that I really value and hope to be able to continue to deploy. So let me just first take on this question of aesthetics and ethics in architecture. You know, there's a continuing and recurring debate that occurs within the fine arts, and architecture is part of that, from someone like Oscar Wilde's claiming that all art must be useless, to the philosopher and critic Walter Pater saying, art comes to you proposing frankly to give nothing but the highest quality to your moments as they pass, and simply for those moments' sake. And so in some ways, that kind of art for art's sake, which we in architecture adopted, particularly during the period of high autonomy, that we would be doing architecture for architecture's sake, and isolate its history and its practices as being only about architecture, means that we left the ethical questions aside, at least temporarily, in order to do some other disciplinary work. But I think architecture's always struggled against that, obviously, because it has an interiority and a functionality that's part of its definition. And so you look at something like Frank Gehry's Disney Concert Hall or your own museum here in Toronto, and though it is aesthetically profound and expressive and formalistic, it still works. It still has a function. And that we see that it ought to be doing both of those things. We can see that it ought to be doing both those things well. But I think the separation from aesthetics and ethics has led us to also imagine that the everyday built environment doesn't really need architecture, that function can be separated, and somehow we can just produce that everyday working class environment without being bothered by aesthetic formation. And it takes someone like me to look at, you know, this public housing or dingbats and see the architectural modern thread in that, which is not unattractive to me. But for most people in the general public, these are seen as kind of throwaway environments. And I'm particularly resistant to an idea that aesthetics and privilege have to go hand in hand. You can imagine then that spatial justice is already embodied in the question of aesthetics and who gets them. So if you look in the history of architecture for where ethics and morals and judgment have been most clearly embodied, it's probably in the history of utopian thought. And when we look at the material manifestations of that utopian thought, we see architecture's participation in an ethical world-building kind of project. And as you know, when you think about utopias very long, world-building is very much a defining element of the coherence and totalizing of a utopian project, like this one by Robert Owens, based on the French phalanstère, where it's really a fortress that keeps out those who are not part of the utopian plan and keeps in the utopianists who've chosen, at least at the start, to participate in it. And the architecture reflects something about the godliness or the moral aspect in this Gothic kind of court scheme at the same time. In various periods historically, early 1820s or 1800s. And then, of course, in the 1960s, we had another round of utopian thought, this time, too, with massive holistic thinking from Archigram, in this case, building a massive infrastructure that would allow our ever-changing and dynamic modern life to plug in and throw away and then plug in a new one. I think probably everyone here is familiar with Plug-in City, a really provocative conceptual project, but of course not one that could ever be built because that infrastructure would require something like a fascist state in order to implement it. So the sort of dark underbelly, ethically, of utopias is intrinsic to them. Even in the most optimistic, they're not just Euro-American projects. This is the work of Boris Isaac Kingeles from the Congo, who's working on Kinshasa as the Phantom City. And he says about these incredibly elaborate models that he made during his lifetime, it's a peaceful city. He's trying to reimagine Kinshasa, his adopted city. It's a peaceful city where everybody is free. It's a city that breathes nothing but joy, the beauty of life. It's a melting pot of all the races in the world. Here you live in a paradise, just like heaven. And this idea that you could just make all the goodness fall into one site is at the heart of utopian thinking about this better world. And we have current versions of this. This isn't just a historical phenomenon. This is Bjarke Ingels' idea with the UN Habitat, a very official partner in the project, to build floating cities as sea level rise occurs, that we might be able to all float out in hexagonal patterns and have a second opportunity on the planet somehow. And I guess what you know, if you think about oceanics, or if you've seen other drawings of it, is it very quickly flattens everyday life into something that works as a concept, but not really something that works in the everyday. And that really comes from this notion that to bring a new ethic into architecture, we have to take care of every aspect of life. I'd like to propose to you as a starting point the work of Ruha Benjamin, who's a sociologist and African American studies professor at Princeton, who talks about viral justice and how something very small, like a virus, she wrote this during the pandemic, can actually have even global effects. And she's more interested in those positive ones than the ones we all recently experienced. And she gives the example of Ron Finley, someone who identifies himself as a guerrilla gardener, and he sets up garden projects in wastelands of Los Angeles, in this case, areas that don't have any shade, so lacking shade equity, that have food deserts, and he grows food in these kind of tropical environments and teaches kids how to make their city go from gray to verdant green. So that's Ruha Benjamin's idea of this idea that you could have a minor utopia or a utopian fragment that might blossom into something like viral justice. So I want to take that concept of Benjamin's and think about spatial justice. Of course, it doesn't just come from her. Really, the idea of spatial justice was first used by Ed Soja, a planner who made the clear claim that justice itself has a geography. He was a geographer and a planner. And by that I mean then that the equitable distribution and access to housing, services, amenities, and a livable planet are basic human rights. Design and planning, therefore, can counteract spatial injustices. So if we take Ron Finley's garden and we think about that as an architectural element, what's it mean to have viral justice architecturally or urbanistically? And I'll just show you as a starting point this project by Teddy Cruz and Fauna Foreman from Estudio Cruz and Foreman in the San Diego area, which was a multi-year, more than a decade project of an abandoned church that slowly but surely grew out of their inventive design notions as well as community need to form Casa Familiar. And you can see in the evolution of this kind of model that's shaping up, it has many different functions. It includes immigration services, artist studios, affordable housing, a youth training program, performance space in the former sanctuary. And maybe important for this notion of viral justice or spatial justice that proliferates is the idea that this Casa Familiar near the Mexican border is part of a network of other border community stations that they've proposed and that we'll see if they evolve. But the project that they built and designed at San Diego area church and neighborhood, San Isidro, have become a model or a demonstration of what other projects should look like and how they might then work together. So let me show you one example of how I've been thinking about this similarly at CityLab in UCLA. Because most of the work that I'm doing now is either focused on public sphere, public space, or housing, this idea of how to think about housing anew is fundamental to the work we're doing at CityLab. And if people who are living on the street or sleeping on a park bench are at one extreme of housing and its inadequacy, at the other extreme is this gold standard that seems like we're never going to be able to reach it, and maybe you don't even want to, which is further suburban single-family detached houses, or maybe the one of the apartment building is a much more reasonable kind of model, a denser, smaller footprint kind of housing. Even still, we know that that kind of housing is a long time coming, is not very affordable, and it's going to be a while before we can, if we are aiming towards that, are able to house everyone with some kind of dignity and accessibility. So what's in between those is something I want to look at more closely. Maybe these are temporary solutions, or maybe they fit people at different stages in their lives. But they're the kinds of housing that students tend to live in, or senior citizens, actually. So we already have those available to us. If you look at UCLA, for example, a site that I sometimes take as my test kitchen, not as a place where any solution would stay or remain, but where it might be easiest to build a kind of demonstration model. The area that's right around UCLA is geographically so many barriers around it that it's pushed rents to the highest in the state of California, and in some studies, in some years, the highest in the country. So that means that students are having to live at a great distance from campus, or the campus has to provide all the housing it can for its students. So in some ways, what's ironic at UCLA is we've just offered 100% housing guarantee to students on campus, but it turns out that's only students who can afford to live on campus or who want to live on campus. So that's good. I'm not complaining about that, but it really isn't 100%. There's still huge numbers of students that have been invisible on the campus who live in housing precarious circumstances or who live at great distances from the campus. 43% of the students who commute for over an hour each way. So that means that they come early in the morning. They're sort of a heroic group, really. They come early in the morning to avoid the traffic, and they leave late at night to avoid traffic. And they have no place on campus while they're there. And if they have an early morning class the next day, they have to do it all over again. So it turns out that extreme commutes and housing precarity are almost a single Venn diagram. There's a lot of overlap. It doesn't accommodate for everyone who's housing insecure, but a lot. So we took these students who had been invisible on the campus, long-distance commuters and students who were experiencing housing precarity, and tried to figure out what would work for them on campus. Something between sleeping in their cars, even, and a dormitory room, and came up with this prototype of a pod in which you could study, sleep, have a Zoom class, nap, stay overnight. And we were given, this is with Marta Novak, was the primary designer here, a squash court, and we put 5 of these pods in it, along with ways that students could cook. After hearing all the things that they needed, you register as a long-distance commuter. It's in the rec center, so there's 24-hour security and showers. And if you're a long-distance commuter, you get access to these pods for 2 hours during the day or overnight during finals. We're still arguing with the fire marshal about overnight on a long-term basis, and I'm sure we'll win because we won't give up. But it goes to show how many different constraints there are to doing something novel. You can imagine it was unclear whether this was a piece of furniture or a room. At one point, he thought we might need to sprinkle each one of these pods. So it was progress not to have to do that. In any case, this is extremely popular. Students have to check in and make sure that they are the long-distance commuters, but the good thing is that it's not stigmatizing the students who are housing insecure, because everybody would like to use it, and it's cool. So that kind of dignity that's brought to the students who are these long-distance commuters has created a home away from home from them, and in fact has captured the imagination of not only our campus, but other campuses. So we've built a second one now, which you see in the lower right. It should open, it's open, but it should be completely finished in another month. And there's a third site that's coming, which will be in our new downtown campus. And I'm hoping that this, we have the drawings, they're available, can be something that other campuses would use so that they would set up places, since most campuses have a napping area, to actually use that as a center point where students who have problems with the basic university recipe can come and get services. Turns out 73% of students in higher education in North America now don't fit the standard undergraduate model of being 18 to 24, going home for the summer, having income from their parents. So the normal student is not the conventional student. It's not even the normal student any longer. And so these kinds of accommodations on campus will end up being more important, and maybe even at other kinds of facilities. But obviously, that's not a housing solution. It's a temporary overnight solution. It's more like a youth hostel for students. Okay, so unpacking what we've learned from these different kinds of experiments is what I'd like to do now, just looking at a few of the general principles that I would say are the means by which we would advance spatial justice through architecture and design. So the first one is that we need to design generative projects, not singular solutions. I've alluded to that already. The second is that we specifically leverage design to open paths towards the world we want. That's our skill in architecture, and that's the one we need to use very carefully and with tremendous expertise so that the best we do is on offer. And the last is that we would really take advantage of these kinds of generative projects and our ability to leverage design at times when they're most needed, at times of crises. The other 4 that are underneath, undoing the whiteness of architecture's history, creating radically public buildings and cities, engaging partnerships of difference, and building legible policy are all part of the book, but I'm not going to focus on that here. We could talk about it in question and answer. So let's go back to this idea of generative projects for a moment. This is a set of buildings that I think everyone has seen now. It's an extremely well-circulated project coming out of Chile by Elemental Architects, Alejandro Aravena being the lead of that. It's a suburb of Santiago, Iquique, where these half houses called Quinta Monroy have been built. And the backstory of them is pretty interesting and elaborate. I'll just mention a few factors, which is that this is all social housing offered as public housing, basically, by the government. But it was a site where people already had built informal housing. And when the government was going to rehouse those people in this basically favela, they said they didn't want to go to the suburbs, which would be where the federal government would put them. They wanted to stay right where they were. But that was too expensive to build the standard recipe of public housing for Chile. And so Aravena said, let's build as much of the house as we can with that budget and save a little bit to give back to each resident so they could build the rest. So they built the infrastructural part of the house, the most difficult to build, the kitchens, the stairs, the plumbing, the structure, and left the spaces in between for people to fill in, which they already had tremendous expertise in. They built their whole town before the public housing had even come. And you can see in this image that that infill is pretty effectively done. And what I didn't realize until I did more research on it was that that was also subsidized by government funds, but they didn't have to pay, the government didn't have to pay for the labor. So it's a great model. You can see, however, that people's exuberance kind of exceeded the idea of what this infill would be. People even went up to the 4th floor. Like, why not keep going? And that ability was something that they were fully capable of doing, but the government and the architects hadn't built the structure to accommodate that. And so what's interesting to me about this being a generative project is not just the Quinta Monroy example, but those that followed, one in Mexico and 2 more in Chile, where Elemental actually capped that infill space to try to keep people from going beyond the structural capacity. And in the case in Constitución that you see on the bottom right, they actually put a shell around the entire thing so that the infill became much easier. And then Elemental put all the drawings for this online. They're open source. And so there's a way in which it's not like normal architectural commissions, right? We get a project in, we do the work. There's sometimes debates about who owns the drawings. Like, the key is proprietary questions, and we compete with each other for work. And in this particular case, it's a reversal of all of that. The work is shared, open source, and intended to be something that could continue to grow. Obviously, you can't do that with every project, but I think it's really important to look at those examples that are being put forward. As I thought about Quinta Monroy and a half house, I realized we had our own half houses here in Toronto and also in LA. It's not the same model of a vertical half house, but it's the suburban half house, right? Really what we have is half lots. So we have properties that are only half utilized often, right? There's a backyard that no one wants to mow or garden in many cases. There's probably some wonderful gardeners here. But it's unutilized space that historically has been used very effectively, particularly in working class, blue collar neighborhoods, as income generating from the start. Either there was some kind of household economy, car repair, or animals, or people built informal housing back there, either for their kids or their parents or for renters. So we started looking at these half-utilized lots across Los Angeles and realized in some neighborhoods as many as 2/3 of the lots already had illegal units on them. So people had been struggling against law to build what was really going to work for them economically. That seemed like an indigenous practice that we ought to figure out how to harness. One of the things that hadn't been done before, a lot of people had been talking about granny flats. There was even a law on the books that didn't effectively allow anyone to build for a variety of complicated reasons. That what we hadn't done is looked at the different types of lots and different types of starter houses that existed on those lots. And that turned out to be pretty complicated. Not every lot, and a lot of people had already changed their house enough so that there wasn't a way to build an extra unit on it. What was the low-hanging fruit here in the suburban context for building another house on the second half of the lot? The first was something like large lots. The second was something like corner lots, and the last were alley lots. Makes total sense. And if you watch how that grows, it's all happening in the backyards. People don't really notice it unless there's more traffic or less parking, and that's the kind of thing that really worried people at the start. In thinking about this, we started talking to the people who were either for or against secondary units. We did field research about where those were built and how they were built. And by the time we were done, we really knew what was going to work for the Los Angeles context. Turned out something like 70 to 80% of the lots were mid-block lots, not in that low-hanging fruit. And how were we going to get a house down a side yard setback without craning in an entire construction system of some sort? So we started working on collapsible frames. This is a full-scale demonstration that we built on the UCLA campus that was built by myself and students and Kevin Daly Architects as the main designers, that we carried ourselves and popped up into place with a inventive kind of skin, a vacuum-sealed skin around an insulating matrix, all as a test to see if we could make a lighter and more easily constructible and recyclable house. A study of what might be possible in people's backyards. Fortunately, unbeknownst to me until the last moment, I realized that your own faculty member here, Karen Chappell, was working at UC Berkeley with a team just like we were in Southern California to figure out how to do backyard homes or additional units on suburban housing in Northern California, which has a totally different housing stock, maybe like the difference between downtown Toronto and the suburbs. So we married our two bills that we were working on simultaneously, meaning they added all of ours to theirs and we added all of theirs to ours. And between the two, we ended up with legislation that was really effective at unplugging a sea of secondary units. And as Robert mentioned, our analysis of the California landscape indicates that there might be as many as 8 million units that could be built. And maybe from my point of view, one of the most, not only is the production of secondary units ramping up and continuing to ramp up since this law was put into place in 2017. Every year there's been more and more secondary units built. But there's also been more and more follow-on legislation and programs that make this a much more robust kind of densification of the city. One of the functions that Los Angeles took on, as have other cities in the state of California, is to build what they call a standard plan program. So any architect can enter a plan that they think of as a good granny flat or backyard home. For instance, our little demonstration house sits exactly on a 2-car garage footprint. And that's a kind of standardization that you might think would work in a number of backyards. These are some of the standard plans that were submitted and that any resident who wants to build one can take out for free and then consult with the architect to tweak it and turn it into a house that works in their backyard. A lot of controversy about that, which again, we can talk about if you're interested. Another follow-on, though, has been the added densification that's occurring. I think Toronto is thinking now of a secondary unit bill, and I think this might be frightening to the people who are resisting secondary units, because the thing that happened immediately after we unplugged the dike for secondary units is then 3 units became possible and new legislation was written for that. And maybe the most important though they didn't have the 10 years of study that we put into the secondary unit, rental unit, is this new law called SB 9, which allows 4 units to be built on a site and a lot split so that we could actually make land more affordable by making 2 independently owned pieces of property where there was formerly one, and each one of those, as you can see in that last diagram at the bottom, can have 2 units. So in the great story of how do we make the suburbs accessible to as many people as possible, including those whom we excluded through various racial practices in the past, opening up opportunities for home ownership is a major one. Okay, so generative projects, these are really going to accumulate these 3 ideas or principles I was talking about. Another one is that we leverage design, and in some ways this is maybe the one that I think is most important and most obvious, yet something that has been harder for me to communicate to architectural audiences. And it goes back to that very first slide of Disney Concert Hall, that good design and equity have to go hand in hand, that good design and ethics are one. So if we aren't leveraging design as we're trying to build spatial justice, we're not bringing what we have to offer to the table. It's not a matter of just listening and responding to communities. It's a matter of actually giving them all you've got that's as good as it can get. And to be good designers means that we study hard and we work hard to make sure every possible avenue and design opportunity has been investigated. I think one of the projects I could show you about this is the Astor Gates projects in Southside Chicago, where he, on a shoestring, started buying houses and then refurbishing them for the community that lived there. And I'm going to show you a couple projects that are anti-gentrification projects, in part because that's a kind of dilemma that I think a lot of architects are struggling with as we densify neighborhoods so that we don't make the same mistakes we made in the past. I have two small examples to show you of how design and anti-gentrification go together. This one, called the Dorchester Projects, is the first. In this case, the Astor Gates found a bookstore and a record store that were going out of business. He had those collections donated, and he made an archive of those artistic works and literary works in the neighborhood, so that he made a new public space out of a building that was restored. This neighborhood is one that was, like so many neighborhoods of color, under threat of redevelopment and displacement of all the residents. And so it's not just small projects like the Archive House that you see on the left, but also public housing that's getting renewed architectural attention to become dignified places to live, like this artist and low-income resident collaborative public housing that you see on the right. And maybe the way that design gets leveraged is over and over and over in this particular community, where someone stays with that project, the whole project of uplifting a neighborhood, each time with a design solution that actually serves its residents, but also dignifies and makes more robust the whole community. Another one that I find is kind of tiny, but also very inspirational, is the project in Dallas, Texas, by BC Workshop. Not unlike the Astor Gates project, but this particular street, Congo Street, was in the beginning of the 2000s, slated already for redevelopment, had been targeted by the city to improve and upgrade, just like we've done historically throughout urban renewal eras, only this was just in this century, where the neighbors really didn't want to go. And BC Workshop, along with some students from UT Arlington, came in and said, let's try to preserve this for the people who live there now. And in all of my housing work, particularly in low-income neighborhoods of color, that, no matter how hard you try, tends to displace people during the remodeling process. So people can't come back, because then the thing that's there is more valuable and not affordable any longer. So BC Workshop did the first project was this holding house. These are super modest architectural projects, but with real architectural aspirations, at least in some of the instances. The holding house was the place where every family moved out of their existing house while their house was getting remodeled. They made sure that they didn't add more than 10% square footage to the house and kept the labor costs low so that people didn't have additional loans or rents that they had to pay, and basically reestablished this whole street for the neighbors that had always lived there. And one more step in this kind of leveraging design for invisible projects is one that I'm working on in CityLab right now with the mayor of Los Angeles, whose primary interest is in building more housing, since we have a incredible affordable housing crisis. It turns out that they were opening up public land, as is happening in many cities, for affordable housing construction. But we looked at the sort of array of affordable land that was in the city, and 4,000 lots were less than a quarter acre. The kind of lot that a developer wouldn't really be attracted to, because you can't build enough for the economies of scale that they tend to seek. But 4,000 lots, that's a lot of land that's just sitting there not getting used by the city. So we proposed to the mayor, and you can see on the map on the upper left, it's like confetti, it's just sprinkled every place. We are working now with the mayor's office to set up a design competition with designers and builders to see if new forms of housing, affordable housing in particular, might be possible to spread over 3 lots at a minimum, so that there would be a prototype that would be made and shared on 3 similar lots. And the city is willing to give the land to the winners of that competition. So I'm very optimistic that we're going to have some new demonstrations that will show the way towards infill housing that maybe would have 5 to 20 units on each lot, and could build as many as 50,000 units on land that's basically free. Okay, that takes design to do that, to inspire that kind of change. So the last example I'll give you is this question of critical junctures. And here I think you recognize the image of the Sendai tsunami, earthquake, and nuclear disaster that all occurred in the Great East Japan earthquake. At times of shared trauma or crisis, where architecture's transformative capacity is called for on behalf of spatial justice, at a breaking point, these kinds of new collective possibilities can form, and enabling policy can result. So in Japan, something like 20,000 people died in that 3/11 event, and 500,000 people were displaced. Most of those people were elderly people who lived in a kind of fishing and water-based economy. And they were all relocated into these emergency settlements, single, isolated dwellings, super efficiently. The Japanese government responded immediately and had a rule that they lived up to, which was that it was only going to be there for 5 years, and by then the housing would be rebuilt. It's kind of a miraculous achievement. But at the same time, they left out a lot that architects, Japanese architects, saw they could bring to the project. So the Japanese government was only working with engineers. They didn't want any architects involved. They would slow it down and, try to make it nice, and they just wanted to get it built. And you can see how those kind of priorities would take precedence. But the Japanese architects who stepped in did something I think of as very heroic and thoughtful. There were 2 groups of architects who responded. The first was ArchiAid, which was led by a colleague of mine, Hitoshi Abe, which really brought the people who lived in those villages, now displaced into emergency resettlement districts, together to say, how should your village be reconstituted, and drew up the plans for the whole town so that the people who lived there could take those back to the government and the engineers and have a lobbying position in the whole conversation. And it was helpful in a number of cities to have that effective planning alternative that the architects provided. A more direct one was led by Toyo Ito, and it was called the Homes for All project. And that was because the isolation had been severe in the resettlement villages. They prioritized a community hall, basically, that only had two programmatic requirements: a place to cook and a place to gather. And then people donated materials and donated labor and built 29 of these homes for all in each of the different resettlement villages, and they became the social heart of what would otherwise have been a really alienating 5-year experience, and brought the people who had had such a traumatic experience back some kind of common and shared public good. And in some instances, these homes for all were loved well enough that people disassembled them and rebuilt them in the towns when their final settlements were created. So in this kind of homes for all model, you can see that these three principles work together. How's my time? Yep, just about done. If there's a point of crisis now for most of us in North American cities, it's really our huge and growing unsheltered population that we need to start to think about. And it's a classic problem that architects feel like is not theirs. Like, we can't really design a tiny house. Those aren't actually good solutions. You might say the same thing about the study pods. It's not a good permanent solution. It's only a stopgap. This has got to be an economic solution or a job solution or a public subsidy solution. But I guess I would say that that's never an adequate answer. And if you agree with the principles of viral spatial justice, you think, where can I possibly operate in a way that will begin to advance the justice causes here? And we can see in the data about people who are living unhoused that it too is a racist legacy that remains, not only of the land use legacy, but also of the carceral system in which many of the people who are living on the street have been churned through. So it's much more likely to affect Black and Latino residents of a city in the United States than their white counterparts. So maybe if you look at these kinds of solutions like the Astor Gates or the secondary units, you can say, well, that's a tiny drop in this bucket and it's very unlikely to reach the people on the street. But maybe there's a way in which building more densely, using the land more effectively, and keeping people in their neighborhoods before they become homeless isn't such a bad starting point. And I think of that as something we would call projective design research. This is actually a term that came from Robert Somol many years ago, and has become more meaningful to me really now, that if we're thinking forward, we're actually doing research about the future. And that's not a standard model, especially for empirical research in the university, but it's the kind of research that architects are always doing, because we are always imagining possible futures. And if we do that systematically, we can begin to address something as complicated as our unhoused population or as housing precarity. So I'll just show you the last piece of research we're doing about affordability that follows on that model, that is basically using every possible means we have at the moment to build affordability where there's housing precarity. And in this particular instance, it's addressing the fact that when we added secondary units, we couldn't control affordability. Right? It was going to be rented for whatever the homeowner had decided they could get. And that was outside of the public control of any kind of affordability mandate. Public land is a different matter, and when we looked at the landscapes around us, what was available was school land, and we had a huge population of teachers, custodians, janitors, cafeteria workers who were working at those schools who couldn't afford to live in their own districts. So teachers were actually living in their cars. Teacher aides were living with their parents, even though they were full-blown grown-ups and had full-time jobs. So in architecture experiments, we started looking at what it would be like to add housing, affordable housing, to school properties. This is another kind of 10-year project, and you can see that these projects that we work on at CityLab, the same way Cruz and Foreman do, never really seem to end because you're always building a network. There had been, out of 10,500 school properties in the state of California, 4 had built housing on them. So, and there was 80 that we, in our preliminary research, 80 different districts that wanted to build it but couldn't figure out how. So if you can imagine, if you're a homeowner, it's hard to figure out how to build a accessory dwelling unit in your backyard. School boards could hardly imagine how to do anything besides kind of keep education going. They didn't want to be housing developers. So the 4 that had been built, 3 of them were in Los Angeles, the second largest school district in the country, which has its own real estate division. We studied those. We tried to understand what was the barriers for that. We tried to figure out what were the stages that we could intervene, either by design principle or by policy, to make this an easier process. And that led to the writing of the second piece of legislation, which basically changed the zoning on all the school land and allowed for a certain 35-foot by right development so that neighbors couldn't automatically stop relatively reasonable densities from happening. Most neighborhoods actually want to house their teachers, so this was a very good kind of project to begin transforming public land into affordable housing. So the legislation took effect this January, so it's only been in place now for, a month, 2 months. And we've already got the first, we realized school boards wouldn't be able to do this, so we're now training them in an academy where I'm bringing architects to work with school boards and districts to show them how to move through this process. And it's our estimate that this will shorten the development process by about half, from what was 8 years to maybe 4. Still a really long period of time, but we're building a cohort of demonstration cases so that other districts can see how it's done. So just in review, the whole idea was that the art of architecture could be harnessed for useful and ethical purposes, and that everyday architecture can embody those same kinds of aesthetic and justice goals. Small-scale practices that proliferate can create new parts of a viral spatial justice. And really, architectural demonstrations of architecture's promise already abound. So this notion of a promise is what really, I would say, underlies the projective future of our field and of our shared public field. This is my crew. These are the people at CityLab who work with us, and I always like to give them credit at the end because I couldn't be doing anything I do without these folks. So thanks very much. Yeah. Do you want to look at the team while we, okay. Maybe I'll take it back to the very first slide.
Okay. Oh, yes, sure.
Was that my microphone?
I'm not sure.
Maybe I won't.
It's okay to look.
Yeah,
Good to look at.
they're nice people.
Thank you. That was very encouraging.
Yes, I'm an eternal optimist.
There are a lot of different things to think about in what you presented and in what you have been writing about and doing. One of the things that struck me was, well, there are two things that are related. One is something that you had written about in the book, which was after passing legislation, there was slow, or after having legislation passed, there was still some slow uptake on using it because of the difficulty that people had in navigating it. And that one of the things that you did with your group was to produce a handbook that was available, I guess, online that made that helped people through, and that had a huge impact. But I was also relating that to like another story that you told, which was about, on the one hand, people are anxious about changes in density, changes in pattern. They often have the worst, I guess, dreams of what that might bring about. And that another thing that architects do is that they help people to understand what change might look like. So I keep thinking about this, these two tracks of making visible and making understandable what change might be and how to navigate it. I'm just wondering if there's something you can say about that.
That's a really nice connection. In my experience, it turns out that when people see something, it's less fearful, right? And in fact, we have such ingrained conventions that's brought about by lending institutions, that's brought about by developer culture, that it's very hard to get any kind of substantial change. So how do you begin to breed, how do you get a new goose for the ducklings to follow, in a way? It's, if you're thinking of developers and banks, they need to see it to be able to take the risks that are involved in that. So one way is to sort of lay out the how-to, which is almost an interim step. That's the handbook period. And I think we've now made handbooks for everything we've tried to get that will proliferate. So we also have a handbook for education, workforce, housing. They're actually really hard to do because how to do it hasn't been exactly tested yet, which is why I think the ADU handbook was so successful, especially in the first couple of years. But once the flow gets going, as it has with ADUs, then there are builders who know how to do it. There's people driving around in trucks that say, need an ADU? I mean, it's not rocket science. And at the beginning, the planning department didn't even know how to do it. So I would call in and say, I have a backyard and I want to build a unit where my garage was, and they'd say, oh, you can't do that. So that's just what we wrote into the law. I know I can. How am I going to get these people to say the right things to encourage this to happen? So once the production starts up, then there's a kind of reality check. So the handbooks aren't really needed anymore. But in that early phase, we're all kind of materialists in the end. That was our shared reality is what probably gives us the most confidence of moving forward.
Yeah, I was thinking, for instance, even getting legislation to change the as of right building on the school lots. I mean, you may have to, since the people who are ultimately voting on these changes are concerned with electoral politics, they have to prove to those voting that it's not a scary thing. So you have to demonstrate through architectural design, the visioning of possible futures, that it's okay.
Yeah, when I was lobbying in Sacramento to get some of this legislation done, there was a very interesting guy that came up at the committees before me, a young congressman, assemblyman from a very conservative district. He still lived with his parents. He was 23. He couldn't afford a house in his own district. And he would set up in front of every committee to lobby for social housing. And what he had were two pictures on either side of him. He's the only person I've ever seen in Sacramento that tried to show somebody what he was talking about. And it was a picture of Karl Marx Hof in Vienna and some completely random affordable housing somewhere in San Diego. And he said, this is what I'm lobbying for. This is what I want. And all the people on the committee would look at it and say, oh, that's not so bad, as if they had never really thought about what affordable housing looked like. And it was such an education for me to see that, really in our everyday life, something as simple as an illustration has a lot of power. It's not enough, but it has more power than I was aware of. Then you have to slog through all the rest of it. But at least if you can get the door of the imagination open, you can have some kind of conversation. I think the other thing that I would say about this is that it's not really part of what we think of we're going to do in architecture is to write policy and to teach academies and to make handbooks. But sometimes I think if there are some of us who are willing to do that, the impacts for all of us will be greater.
Right. I mean, it's interesting to somehow be able to move back and forth between policy to, or in urban design, we design things, then we try to say, well, what are the rules that produce this end? Or if we make rules, what are the results of the rules? And then you have to move back and forth.
Yeah.
The other thing I was thinking about, it's also kind of I suppose, a generation reflection, my generation's reflection. But, I came of age during the period of what you described as the advocacy for an autonomous architecture. And in a sense, even though that architecture was often talked about in terms of its being critical, there was an aesthetics attached to that. And it was never linked to what I sometimes think of as the good life, whatever that might mean. I mean, whatever it might mean to a variety of different people. And I think now, actually what is beautiful in architecture is an architecture that captures something that we can see into as the good life. And I just wonder, so I was thinking a little bit about, you remarked again in your book on the attraction to architecture without architects. It was an exhibition at MoMA that Bernard Rudofsky mounted. And that was very attractive to a lot of maybe what we call late modern architects, but it was attractive in a way that while different from the white architecture of the modernist past, it was still a kind of, beautiful systems abstract architecture. So it still had its aesthetics still, I think, belong to a kind of what you might think of as a high aesthetics category. And I think that you are trying to shape new aesthetics in relationship to everyday urbanism, or everyday life, and to discover more modest inflections that are still situated more within everyday circumstances in which we discover how the beauty of the architecture is connected to the patterns of life that people shape in them.
Yeah, that's thoughtful. I think the work that I did right after my studies of architecture, which were really like an anthropologist working in architecture firms, that was an early book that I wrote, made me realize that all architecture was conversational and negotiated. It wasn't as if, what we were trying to do in studio was to invent something on our own and to be the creative genius that had it and to get our studio master to love it and whatever that might have been about. I mean, even that's a conversation, but this conversational way that some of the finest architects were really building beautiful work struck me as something I didn't fully understand and I wasn't being taught. And so I started thinking about how aesthetics and collaboration have always been posed against one another, and yet really it's the finest craft of architecture to be able to put those together. And if you think that, then you think, why can't community engagement, for example, be part of the creation of really beautiful work that has public value and dignity and beauty? And why isn't it that we can't, as a profession, dedicate ourselves to making sure that the public domain is filled with this work that isn't brought in like a lunar landing, but is actually something that arises out of our genuine engagement with others who have real knowledge that we could learn from. So that's kind of a roundabout way of talking about your question, but I think that the issue for me is that aesthetics and privilege have to be decoupled if we're ever going to be able to succeed in making this world that we want to live in. Because really, there's not enough privilege to go around as it should be. We need to build a kind of base of equity in order for us to get more a world in which we share a planet that we can live in. That sounds like such a kind of moral message. I
Call
don't
to
really
action.
tend to be moralizing, but it is a belief system.
Yeah. I have a lot more questions, but I think I'll give members of the audience a chance to ask their own. So, are there people out there?
So I guess it's obviously that we're having a housing crisis in Toronto. So did we get a chance to share those ideas with the mayor's office here in Toronto to see what they can do about it?
I'm not sure if I understood the question.
Have you had a chance to share your ideas with the mayor's office here, since we too are?
Oh, in Toronto? No, I would love to do that, but no. Though I think there are probably plenty of architects sharing some views. I hope so, anyway. And I do know that your suburbs and our suburbs are not unalike. So the possibility of, transformative work is also here. You actually have a better transit system, when we're still struggling with ours, but it's getting better, which would make those possibilities even greater.
Toronto is, when I first moved here, I lived in LA, and I was struck by the there are many similarities.
Mm-hmm.
I used to say kind of cattily, oh, it's like LA without the mountains, ocean, sunshine, movies. But actually, I love Toronto, so just to be clear,
Yeah.
it has valleys. Yes.
It has seasons.
We'll come to you.
Who first? Okay.
Somebody back there first?
Yeah.
So can I ask? Thank you. Hi. Thank you so much for your talk. I think a lot of the things that you spoke today, I've seen personally a lot in Toronto as well. There's ongoing research in this, at Daniel's faculty right now, where this faculty has pushed for more inclusion for ADUs, detached homes. So even recently, EHON has passed, a change in the bylaws to have 4+ units onto residential sites in Toronto alone. But what I've learned, what I've seen so far, the biggest resistance to change really is neighborhoods and communities who live in the suburbs, who own property, and it really ties into the idea of land ownership as the sort of the benefit of capitalism, but also the ills of capitalism. So my question really stems to, if we want to see the moral changes that you're speaking about, how do you convince people who own property who don't want these changes because they fear it would either devalue their home or change the way they perceive their suburbs? How do you essentially fight against NIMBYs?
Yeah. Well, that's what I was referring to as sort of like taking your finger out of the dike in a way. And what's true in most cities that have managed to pass ADU laws is that the informal construction of ADUs is already present in many places. I suspect that's true in Toronto as well. And if you can pass that, we could only pass it at the state level. I couldn't pass it at the local level because there was too many individuals who were resisting it, whereas at the state level they recognized, and maybe this would be true at the provincial level here, the housing crisis was something that was a broader umbrella than cities alone or than individual neighbors alone. Once the state law passed, it actually produced an effect that I was not expecting but should have known, and that was that property values were accelerated by the potential of building a second unit. So people were worried about property values being negatively impacted. It was the opposite, which was the opposite of what I had in mind. You know, I wanted more small units to be built, which I thought would be more affordable. You know, that was not the case. It turned out property values and ADUs went hand in hand, up and outside of affordability. So in some ways, I think it's getting a start in it, or to looking to the other cities that have done it. You know, Portland, Minneapolis, there's a number of cities that have pretty substantial suburban transformations going on, and that data is pretty convincing.
There was something, just a quick interjection here, just because in one of the things that you mentioned in talking about the consultation with communities was that as groups, people were resistant, but as individuals, they favored it.
Right.
And then you had to figure out how to join these two different positions.
Well, there was always some powerful neighbor that got in the way of a city council approval. I'm not sure what your municipal governance structure is here, but in that sense, because of the critical juncture or this crisis that was happening all California-wide, the state legislators were somewhat inoculated against the problems in individual neighborhoods. And so they could pass law, and there's been a slew of pro-housing laws now that have passed, starting with the ADU law, but it's been a watershed lately. I don't know how long that'll last, but it's been really promising.
Thank you so much for your wonderful talk. There was, I think it was one of our great Toronto journalists, Sean McAuliffe, said of the previous mayor of Toronto that the mayor was involved in building a lot of new public projects and things, but then wouldn't do the work to ensure that they keep being maintained. And this is something that I think, I'm curious what your thoughts are on we do the design work that brings the aesthetic, but how do we care also about like maintaining the infrastructure and embedding that the kind of maintenance into work? Is that something that you've been able to kind of bring into the policy as well?
Wow, yeah, that you just created a whole new area of work for my lab, and I'm not sure there's enough of us to do that. It's an extremely important question. Because I've been so involved in housing, I haven't had the maintenance issues, although when I think back to the historical work I've done, that's been a kind of key to negative things that transpire subsequently. So figuring out how to, the one thing I have thought about is how you sustain a kind of set of practices when you actually have limited resources in land, in infrastructure, for example. But I don't really have I don't think I have a good answer for that, in part because that hasn't been the area I've been working in, though I hope somebody starts a new set of research projects around that topic, because if you can't maintain it, it's only a short-term solution, and we know now from all the sustainability work that that isn't going to move us in the right direction. I say that, but you know, in the housing work, really what we're trying to do is not build in maintenance to the work we're doing now, which would be kind of addressing directly what you're saying, but actually trying to maintain the existing fabric of cities that already exists. And so that is one way that we're being very thoughtful about. You know, the anti-gentrification work is actually very much in keeping with that, which is we shouldn't be always building new. We should be repairing and maintaining the things we have.
Petros, you have the speaker, but could you pass that one back?
Hi, thank you so much for your lecture. I'm glad that some of our students are in the room, and I hope we can pass it on to many students who I think are really involved in this line of work. I have a very specific question. From the formulation of what you call the Projective Design Research Project in the studio or in the lab to the writing of the legislation, can you share with us some of the steps required or how this came about? I guess from a planning perspective, they may be standardized, perhaps. But did you actually, you or the lab, write the legislation?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, that's an easy answer. And how? I mean,
How? Yeah, that's why I say it's like learning Etruscan. You know, I mean, so the steps was first to understand what the barriers were to achieving the thing that we had in mind that everybody was already trying to do. And in that sense, it goes back to this question of like, how do you build, let's just take the ADU law for starters. People were building them, but they weren't legal. And yet there was a law in the books that made it possible for them to be legal. So where was the mismatch? That was not a straightforward, there was not a straightforward answer to that. And I had a partner, a woman named Jane Blumenfeld, who I consider one of the most creative planners I know, who's a cityLAB fellow. And she and I worked on it together, and she already spoke policy Etruscan, the equivalent. So together, we started, and I was always the one who was about 100 feet out, and she was always the one in the weeds, and took both those perspectives to do this. So, we studied as I was showing you, we studied 8-9 years of research. That was one of the steps, a big long step. But the actual writing of the legislation, she and I took existing legislation, the existing ADU legislation, and tried to undo the things that were wrong. Then we tried to add the things that would incentivize housing. So for instance, it turns out even in Los Angeles, which may be here in Toronto, we could get parking out of the single-family house equation if we associated it with a particular kind of transit stop, a high-volume transit stop, which meant that buses came every 15 minutes. 85% of Los Angeles is within 500 feet of a high-volume transit stop, even a city that's not very well served by infrastructure. So this is just an example to take that step. All right, now, if we could define that territory and that volume, we could take parking out of the equation, which would allow a much greater percentage of lots to have a secondary unit, because you wouldn't have to park 4 cars on it, which was the way it had been restricted in the past. You would only have to park the 2 cars, one for each house. So in doing that, we studied all the existing legislation, borrowed it. This is the way it gets done in policy law. And then we sent it to lawyers, policy analysts, who would say, oh, well, really at the last minute with the ADU law, this was Karen Chappell's work and ours, we had one mistaken term that could have undone the entire thing. If you've done policy work, you know how that's possible. And we just happened to work with a really great lawyer who found that. And now I have that legal and housing network so that when we did the second legislation, I sent a set of goals that I wanted to achieve to someone in Sacramento's legislative brain trust, and they sent me back relatively relevant legislation that I could sample from. And so it was a much more expedient process. I'm hoping that each time I try to do this, it doesn't take me another 10 years, or I only have like one more law left.
Yeah, that was partly my second question. How does this improve, in fact?
Wait a second, just one question. What was the term?
What's that?
What was the term that you...
10 years?
No. The term, the word in the legislative...
Oh, may or shall.
As opposed to?
May or shall. If you
May
say
or shall.
shall, you have to do it. If you say may, you don't. And the may was what we'd put in, and we meant shall, and it was completely opposite. Yeah. That's the kind of thing that, you You feel like, how does anyone ever follow this? In a way, it's kind of like mathematical proof writing. I mean, that was the only equivalent I could draw, is that you want the simplest and most elegant path towards a solution. That's almost counterintuitive to the way legislation's written. But what I've found is that the subsequent follow-on legislation is really doing a good job at making a cleaner proof. So right now there's a person working on our education workforce housing bill who I think is going to make it much stronger. I'm really optimistic about it. And there is no author association with these things. I claim I co-authored it, but 2 years later, my bill is like way down at the bottom of the pile, and there's like 5 more really good bills on top of it. So
It's really interesting because this suggests a kind of team structure. We're used to working with certain team structures for delivering public projects, especially on the design side, architects, engineers, landscape architects, and all that. And the team structure that emerges from this, I think, is very interesting to learn from.
Thank
And
you.
yeah, lawyers. It's a pleasure to work with lawyers sometimes for these reasons.
Thank you.
I have another question over here.
Yeah, hi.
We'll make this the last one tonight.
Well, first I will commend you for the legislation in California. I lived in LA for 16 years before I moved here a year ago. So that's a big feat because I work in interiors. And before that I was in fashion. And so I've watched LA change drastically. And it's especially commendable with all of the NIMBYs, which I suppose leads a little bit into my question, which is one of verticality and density. So how, like as you said, once that legislation passed, and I saw how it happened, that there was a lot of people who viewed that as kind of hawkish in a way to increase property value and put in apartments, ADUs, that they could then charge incredibly high rents,
Yes.
which is
Yeah.
an issue. I dealt with it there. Most of my friends dealt with it there. And that all ties into a lot of different artists who are trying to do interesting things that you brought up. Like Ron Finley is amazing. Theaster Gates, what they've done is really wonderful and sort of bringing life back to places that had been forgotten. But in all of these, as you start addressing tiny homes, ADUs, is how you kind of build up so that you can house more people in more areas, so that gentrification doesn't become such a big problem, and that where people take advantage of something that was a beautiful idea of Theaster Gates or Ron Finley and try to take it for themselves and make as much
Yeah.
money as they can. Does that
Right.
make sense? I know there's a lot of things tied into that.
Yeah, no, that's especially when we have a severe housing crisis as we have now, production will never get us out of it, right? Or maybe never is not the right word, but it's a long time coming. And in between now and when we might have enough housing, there's a lot of gouging going on. It will all be unaffordable. So how do you deal with that? My solution is to work off public land at the moment. So I'm always looking for this low-hanging fruit. Like, where can we do demonstrations that will ensure affordability and provide new alternatives that then could be modeled by the market rate developers? Because they're going to keep doing what they're doing no matter what we say, right? Because they've got their loans. I mean, there's lots of reasons for that. They're not evil, but they're driven by profit, not by social justice causes. So I'm working almost entirely now, having seen that problem, on public land. Now, where's the public land where we could do demonstrations of density? Probably in most cities, it's around transit stops. And where I live, the transit-oriented development is pretty awful. It's tall-ish, but it's not good architecture. And in fact, the legislation that's producing it, seems to me, must be forcing a kind of massing solution that isn't really a very good architectural solution. So I'm interested in working on that, I'm interested in seeing what other people do with that, as just one example. where we might be able to push density and height up while still assuring that we have affordable or attainable housing there. If you don't have some kind of public land in the United States, you don't have the lever very easily. It's going to be interesting to see what we can do with these little tiny lots. There's some really interesting small tower solutions that might be possible. Our mayor, I don't know about yours, is very wary of bringing those to the city. But I'm optimistic that there are some of these sites that are in much more mixed neighborhoods where we could try a few and see if people aren't really attracted to that, which I think they might be.
All right, well, we're going to have to call the evening to a close. And, well, actually, we have refreshments outside, and you can speak with Dana a bit out there. Thank you so much. There are, I think, so many overlapping issues between our cities. It's fascinating to see what you're up to. So thank you so much for the night.
Thank you for your nice questions.
So before you all go out, I just want to let you know that there are other upcoming events. On March 21st, Karen Kuby from our faculty will be joined by architect Paul Karasuvic and housing advocate Leilana Farha to discuss architecture and the right to housing. That's generously supported by the Irving Grossman Fund and Affordable Housing, and their talk will explore how the right to housing, both in Canada and globally, isn't just a political, legal, and economic issue, but also an architectural one. So again, March 21st at 6:30 p.m. here in the main hall. So now you're all invited to join us out in the Commons. Thank you for coming.